Hello, folks. This is our very first lecture on World War One from our AP European History bunker here at Mr. Lawyer's house, also formerly known as my son who's moved out in a state trooper's former bedroom. The bunker is not because we are scared of the coronavirus. It is a bunker because it is the only quiet place in this house. So I'm recording this one for you so we can get going on World War One. I know we finished up imperialism, and we hopefully will be moving on through all of World War One and into the Russian Revolution before we get back. So here we go. By the way, also you'll notice that this was a PowerPoint I borrowed from one of my colleagues who I met at the Reed. She is a very fine teacher and has done the Reed for some time. So yes, I'm giving credit where credit is due. So yeah, we're good. All right, so here we go. World War One, the Great War. So now, like I said, this has been called the Great War. This was definitely what they thought would be the war to end all wars because of the violence. And it is going to be a serious note as the leading into World War II. And it's going to set the stage for it. There is an attempt to try to back off. Now, the tensions we talked about, we're going to go back over some of those things we saw in the Canon diagram, which I am posting on our Google Classroom for those of you that weren't able to copy it down before we went on our short little hiatus here. But the Canon kind of explains what we're doing with this opening idea of what caused the war. The tensions are going to be tried to brought down, like you see on the slide, by the Olympic Games, which were brought back in 1896. The Olympics were, if you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire, that was the beginning of them bringing back the Olympics. There was, like I said, an attempt to try to ratchet down these tensions, but it's not going to be effective, obviously. And we'll talk about how this tensions escalate, besides what we've already talked about. One, we said, if you look at the chart or the drawing on the that we had on the board of the Canon, you can see that one of the causes of this was the alliance system. And what had happened before this, when Bismarck had come in and he established this new Germany, he tried to use realpolitik to try to strengthen and isolate possible forces that would keep Germany from growing and expanding and being safe in the long run. We already talked about how the Franco-Prussian War had upset the French. The French had seen a devastating defeat by Bismarck's forces, who were using more sophisticated weapons and tactics, and had at one point even resorted to shelling the city of Paris. It caused them to have food shortages and mass casualties, and then, like we discussed, it did cause the Paris Commune. That destructive force that had happened by the Franco-Prussian War and the treaty after, where they lost territories in Alsace-Lorraine, and they were forced to pay huge war reparations, is going to be one of the triggers that causes the French to want to have their own alliance system, and then eventually, once World War I is over, to exact punishment upon the Germans. Now, little side note, at one point, they will become so desperate in the city of Paris that they even ate the animals in the public zoo during the Franco-Prussian War. So, as part of doing that, Bismarck wanted to isolate the French and keep them from exacting revenge, all right? So that's going to lead to him negotiating a agreement with the Russians, which would then, because the English were in what we called splendid isolation, as we've called it before, because they're basically off licking the entire planet in the form of taking over India with the Sepoy Rebellion, and of course taking over China with the lovely sale of opium. They have basically ignored everything else that's been going on. So this isolation that's done by the German Russian resurgence treaty, they basically have made it so that neither one would attack each other. But then, of course, as we talked, Bismarck, it gets fired. And once he gets fired, that's what allowed Germany to break off. It's already signed an alliance with Austria, but now once they've broken off that treaty with Russia, Russia is free to form its own alliances, which will then, of course, lead to an alliance with France. And a lot of this was conducted through the Congress of Berlin when they were negotiating with the Russians, the Germans were. So that will form what we call the Triple Entente. And then, as you can see on the slide, the formation of the Triple Alliance then is Germany and Austria. And remember, this is a if one goes, we all go situation. So our next cause that we saw, then there we are, the Russian-German reinsurance treaty in 1887. And once Kaiser Wilhelm II had basically fired Bismarck, he opens up these possibilities because he refuses to sign this Russian-German reinsurance treaty in 1887. And then we can see the British, like we said, the split in isolation, and of course the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And then, of course, we see the creation of the Triple Entente. So all the players are on the board for the big game, but if one goes, it's all going to go. So the next thing we saw, the Canon itself in the drawing was, of course, the buildup of armaments. The Industrial Revolution is what's going to unleash this one. So before, if it was Bismarck and the alliance system that was setting up that issue, this is the whole problem of the militarism is the Industrial Revolution hard at work, because what we're going to see is this idea of the building up of the battleship fleets, the original, the dreadnought, which is going to be sent out by both the British and the Germans, and then is going to see the massive buildup of these battleships. It's very comparable to what you learned in U.S. history with Alfred Mahan's control of the seas theories that led to the capture of Hawaii and turning it into an American territory for the possession of Pearl Harbor. That was so we could refuel and maintain our battleship fleets. Or in American history, the construction of the Panama Canal, so you'd have a naval power in both the Atlantic and the Pacific without building those fleets. So there's this massive, massive buildup of battleships. And it's not just the battleships, this arms race. You're going to see the beginning of new technologies, like we said, the Maxim machine gun already, which allowed for the takeover of colonial areas. That's going to be another problem, and that technology is going to escalate rapidly in the form of tanks, aircraft, and, of course, poison gas. So, and the fact that these battleships were an easy way to provoke, especially the British. The British are highly sensitive to this idea of being outpaced. You're going to see this same concept of an arms race also in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the rapid buildup of nuclear forces. So hopefully we've learned our lesson, but I guess time will tell. So, and of course, the gunpowder in the drawing was the idea of imperialism. And we talked a little bit about this before we went, but we rushed through it pretty quickly. Imperialism is a major problem because a couple things is that, one, obviously there's the scramble for territories. And obviously you're going to see some very upset individuals in the country, such as we talked about, and hopefully you listened to me when I told you that India almost joined the Japanese in the war against the British. You're also going to see issues in the fact that we're going to use imperialism against the Ottoman empires by convincing Bedouin tribes to fight against them in the Arab states. So the problem with imperialism and triggering the war, however, is at the Berlin Conference, they had divided up in Germany, they had divided up Africa, but now you had new players on the board. We saw that the Italians are making moves on areas in Ethiopia, and we're also going to see Germans, like you see on the slide with the Kruger telegram, where during the Boer War, when the British had subjugated the Zulu and now had moved to control the Boers because of the vast riches of South Africa, the Boers will rise up against the British. And in doing the Kruger telegram, it will basically trigger a British response. What we basically said before, you removing the British from splendid isolation and now moving them towards actually paying attention. The more dangerous one is what happened, as you see on the slide, in 1906, is the Algerian Conference is going to settle what we call the first Moroccan crisis. And this Moroccan crisis is that the Moroccans are going to try to break away from French control. And this is going to trigger a lot of that alliance system, that the Germans come in and seem to be backing the Moroccans. Well, not seeming, they actually are. And the idea is they're thinking they can expand their influences in this region, which then will trigger the French and basically cause French aggression again against the Germans. And so the second Moroccan crisis even escalates this even more, and that the British throw in support against the Germans with the French because they park a gunboat down there, and gunboat's a fancy name for a battleship. So not only are you threatening French imperial holdings, you're also now threatening the British in their main privy of the ideas of their battleships. So you're escalating this, and you're trying to provoke the French now, and unfortunately the British, both in an imperialistic format and in the militarism. So not a very good idea. And I'd like to point out again, the Kaiser Wilhelm II actually thought he was more brilliant than Bismarck. And as this proves, he definitely was not. So nationalism, well, here's where the real fun begins, folks. We already talked about Pan-Slavism and this idea of this nationalistic movement that had been fuming in Serbia, Bosnia, and being fanned by the Russians. This idea of all the Slavs together, and the Russians, as the slide says, saw themselves as big brother. Well, the Ottoman Empire is the sicko man. Same as Russia, same as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was. And it's kind of like a patient on life support. And this is when the Serbs decide to move. The Young Turks had led an uprising, the parliamentary government had weakened the Ottoman Empire. And this kind of was the sign. So you're going to have an uprising by several major states. The Serbians, the Bulgarians, and several others are going to lead into what we call the First Balkan War. All right, the Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and our allies are going to push the Ottoman Empire out of this peninsula, okay? And then what we call the Balkans, okay? Well, then in 1913, Bulgaria, angered that the Serbians and the Greeks had not turned over territories that they had wished to have, basically went after Serbia and Greece. Serbia defeated Bulgaria over Macedonia, and then they were and gained Albania, as it says in the slide. But Austria, with German support, again will hold off the Russians and prevent Serbia from holding on to Albania. Now, you have to understand why this is true, is that this was a major area. This coastal area was where a lot of the Austrian fleet was stationed, okay? And so this triggers, because of the humiliation, it triggers a lot of stuff. One, the Serbians now think that the only way they're going to get to have any influence in this area is to push the Austro-Hungarians out of this area. And you have the Russians who, after Bloody Sunday and the failings of Russian government, and also the fact that the Russians had been defeated in the Russo-Japanese War, they're scrapping for a fight, and they need to prove themselves, especially as the big brothers of these other Slavic states. So that is going to cause what the Serbians believe will be the Third Balkan War, between Austria and Serbia, which actually is World War I. They thought, just like we've seen in other things we talked about in the creation of Italy and the creation of Germany, that Bismarck used little wars with the Danes, little wars with Austria, little wars with France, which didn't expand and go any further. Or how the British had used the Crimean War to hold off the Russians from getting into India and protecting their controls of the Mediterranean Sea. Or how the Italians used conflicts with the Austrians to gain control of territory. These are all examples of how the Serbians actually thought they could cause a little bitty war. But the problem is all these pieces of imperialism, nationalism, militarism, all of them are there now. And everyone is wound tight and ready to do this. And there's no room to back off. The British are protecting their empire. The French are protecting their empire. And also the English are protecting their control of the seas and their military power. The French are also upset over what happened in the Franco-Prussian War. And the Russians are searching for a fight to prove themselves. And you have empires like Austria and the Ottoman Empire who are trying just to stay alive. And so all these things put together, there's no stopping this once it starts. A little region war turns into one of the bloodiest wars in human history. And of course, the immediate cause is the Serbians trying to trigger this little war is the Black Hand, which is funded by Serbia. Now, I posted another video online for you about the assassination. It's very good. It's a little cheesy, I think, but it's kind of shot like a Fast and Furious video, kind of. That goes through the step-by-step and kind of explains what happened on this day. So I'll let it do the talking for that one. And then the blank check. The Germans issue a blank check. Basically, they tell Austria, whatever you decide, we will back you up, thinking that the Austrians, like your friends, will make better decisions. And unfortunately, like your friends, the Austrians don't make better decisions. And all this is triggered by Austria had before asked Serbia for huge reparations and money. They wanted the people that were in this plot to be turned over, and they also wanted territory to be taken from the Serbians. And there's no way the Serbians could have done this. So with the blank check in their pocket, they declare war on Serbia, which triggers Serbia's alliance with Russia, which triggers the German alliance with Austria, which then triggers the French alliance with the Russians, which then when German troops are moved in, and this is what you see, we are now fighting a two-front war, folks. And the funny thing is, we're going to do the same thing again in 1939. So, and then they declare war and everybody moves. The Germans declare war on the British and French, and you'd think, hey, maybe you should take out the Russians first because they're right on your border. The problem is the Germans think that they can actually take the Russians pretty easily, which actually is not the truth. Well, it's kind of the truth because they really are poorly trained and poorly equipped, and they could pretty much march all the way to Moscow. It just takes the time to get there. But they think the French are actually the more powerful force that needs to be dealt with. So what they do is they invade France first. They go through Belgium, who, as I have said before, cannot defend a waffle. And the full force of the German blitzkrieg, well, that's a war ahead, sorry. When the full German force pours through the Belgian front, they are able to push very quickly into France. Matter of fact, it's so quick that it looks like they're actually going to win. And this is going to be exactly what they thought, a short little war. Unfortunately, there's these little taxi cab drivers in Paris. The black taxis in Paris actually work very well at shuttling troops, and that's what they did. They actually used the taxi cabs in Paris to shuttle troops to the line, and they were able to stop the advancing German forces, which ground it to a halt. Once British forces arrive, well, you know what happens next. It's all trench warfare and death and dismemberment like human beings hadn't seen before. So a really quick war almost happened, but taxi drivers stopped it. So this is your European theater. We're down to the Central Powers, which were the Triple Alliance originally of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire decides to join in for fun. And you're asking, wait a minute, isn't Italy part of that? Well, Italy kind of switches sides in both wars. And of course, Bulgaria, because, you need Bulgaria. And then on the other side, the Allies are the Triple Entente, which of course is Britain, France, Russia, and later Japan, Italy, and the United States, when we finally decide that just selling weapons for war doesn't beat being in one. That's a little levity, since it's also going to have a lot to do with unrestricted submarine warfare and a note sent to the Mexican government. So this is what it looks like in perspective. And there's some real weird stuff about this. And we're going to talk more about the war in the Western Front probably in the next video, because I don't want you to have to sit for too long watching every one of these videos. Now, before I stop this one and then we go to part 2, I'd like to point out the irony that for the first time all year, many of you are actually looking at me on your phone, which is kind of ironic, since this is the only time you've actually watched me during a video or watched me during a lecture, because you're staring at your phone, but now you're staring at me on your phone. It's kind of surreal. So, hey, hopefully this helped you out a little bit. Watch the video about the beginning of the war. Part 2 of this about the actual fighting, as you can see the slide that's in front of you right now on the Western Front, is where we're going to start. And so, hey, it's fun teaching you. Watch for part 2. And off we go.